Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Xcession Everything Service Management podcast. I'm Daniel Gilby, joined as always by my co-host Sunil.
Hello.
And today we've got a really great guest with us. Thank you again, Matt, for taking time to join us. We've got Matt Beran from Invgate. I knew I'd get caught out with that, joining us all the way from the US. Matt, great to have you with us. Perhaps for those of our listeners who aren't familiar with you, you could give us a bit of an introduction for our listeners.
Well, thank you for having me, gentlemen. I'm a IT nerd. I call myself an IT industry analyst. I don't know if that's my actual role or what I'm actually doing, but I'm the host of Ticket Volume, a popular ITSM or service management podcast, I'll say. And I do product marketing for Invgate, a service management vendor based out of Argentina that makes both service management software and asset management software.
Very cool. Well, great to have you with us, Matt. Thank you.
So we are really looking forward to having our viewer numbers just shoot through the roof, right? As you know, your popularity from the other side of the pond kind of crashes over us.
I hope that's true. I hope.
So shall I kick things off, Dan?
That would be great, Sunil. I know you had some kind of overview of the things we were going to talk about today that we'd sort of shared with Matt ahead of this call. I'll be just quickly drafting an email to Google so that they can bolster the YouTube servers in the European region to accommodate the massive influx of viewership we'll get from.
Have we signed up for our advertising revenue stream yet or not?
Yeah,
I can't remember.
Not yet. Let's get to it though.
Sorry. Yes, absolutely. So Matt, right? Very excited, as Dan has said, to have you with us. And, you know, as always on the Xcession ESM podcast, right, what we try and do is talk about, you know, trends that we're seeing in the ITSM, ESM world. And, you know, we like people's stories. We like to hear people's opinions. But what we want is for our audience to go away with something of some value, right? Something that they can think about or maybe even action. So for today's conversation, we wanted to center that around something of a dichotomy that we see in the ITSM ESM marketplace. And that dichotomy is that many organizations, both large and small, so across the spectrum, often to us seem to be struggling with basic ITIL processes. So, for example, right, incident management processes are inefficient or weak, right, because maybe they're not capturing the right data at first point of contact, right, or maybe they have an outsourcer, right, that is, you know, maybe not as proactive as they could be in terms of, you know, being super efficient, right? Maybe their contract supports inefficiency. Who knows? Another example might be a portal, right? Everyone has been talking about employee center portals of whatever flavor for many, many years, but so often we talk to customers who've got a very limited service catalog available to them on that portal. CMDB is like a, you know, forever constant, isn't it? Everyone is always struggling with CMDB. And even things like integrations, right? Even what you might consider to be fairly straightforward integrations, like an integration with Active Directory, for example, you find so many organizations who haven't got on top of those sorts of things. So on one hand, you have customers, organizations struggling with the basics, and on the other, you have a vendor landscape, right? It's great that you work for a vendor. You have a vendor landscape that is talking about capability and feature, right, for transformation that doesn't sit with this idea of organizations who can't quite get a handle on their day-to-day. And I don't really mean, you know, the market leader ServiceNow and the agentic AI sort of position they have. That's one view. But even other vendors that say, you know, ITIL out of the box, we can do that in 10 days. You know, we'll sort all those problems out in 10 days. Well, if it's that easy, right? So I guess my first question is, you know, do you also see this, right? Is this your view? And if it is, what do you agree? Or if it's not your view, what do you disagree with?
Yeah, great opener. I mean, I feel like you're highlighting a lot of inherent, it feels like generational debt. We're moving from this service economy into an experience economy. We're moving from ITIL v2 to ITIL v3 to ITIL 4. And I was very careful to not say v4 there. Thank you. Thank you for noticing. But the some of the things you bring up, like incident management being weak, outsourcers not feeling proactive, portals not having what customers expect, and not feeling powerful. All three of those things are situations where IT needs to think philosophically. We need to think a bit bigger. So often it's easy for us as engineers to be drawn down into the weeds. You know, how can we optimize the incident process? How can we categorize this better? How can we leverage the data to get incident to be better? When in reality, what we're really trying to do is remove incidents completely. Incidents should never exist. We call them we call incident management inefficient. Well, even one incident against the service is a lack of planning. It's a lack of preparation. It's a lack of hardening. It's a lack of redundancy. It's a lack of planning. And the same thing goes for proactive outsourcing. If you want an outsourcer that's really going to be altruistic and partner with you, you have to think about that differently. You have to think about that outsourcing relationship in a completely different context than the way that we used to think about it in the 90s and the early 2000s. Look at your financial models for how that MSP or outsourcing vendor is being incentivized, because probably what you're incentivizing is probably what they're doing. If you're paying for every incident that they close, you're going to have a lot of incidents.
Coin operated, absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. If you're making money off of a problem, you don't want to fix it, because if you fix it permanently, that money goes away. And I think a lot of organizations, what's great is that a lot of organizations are starting to think this way. They're starting to come around to this new experience economy, to the new way of thinking about technology. And they're starting to see that, yes, we should be incentivizing our outsourced vendors in a different way. Instead of paying per transaction, we should find a way to partner together so that what we want to accomplish is what they also want to accomplish. So that's kind of where my brain goes right when you start talking about that. There's a couple, like I have a lot more to go on, but do you want to guide the conversation more, or do you want me to just keep rambling?
Keep going, Matt.
Yeah, okay, cool.
It's a really interesting viewpoint to look at it that way, because you're right. You know, it's about what is incentivizing that relationship. Then they're going to do more. You know, how are you incentivizing that commercially or otherwise, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it's not easy, right? These mindset changes aren't easy because we're in the moment. We've got all this stuff going on that is distracting and difficult and complex. Complexity is the name of the game, really. And you brought up the CMDB, and I think that's a great signpost. CMDB is one of those things where, number one, if you invested in it about 20 years ago and you've got a good CMDB still, congratulations, you were cutting edge. You were not only cutting edge, but you stuck to the guns and you've surrounded that thing with process and governance that has worked. And amazing. Tell your story as much as you can, because people need to hear it. And the people who didn't invest 20 years ago are waiting. And I think that is actually a wise choice. If you haven't invested in your CMDB yet, the tools that are coming out that are assisted by AI, discovery, SNMP, and various other protocols is starting to get us to a point where the panacea of a self-discovering CMDB that relates its assets together, CIs, components together into a service map, I think it's right around the corner. Now, there are some vendors that are doing this. I think Dynatrace already has something that does this. There's a couple vendors that kind of have this stuff.
Yeah.
But I think we're about to see a massive explosion in its abilities, its capabilities.
Can I ask you about this, because I think this is so fascinating, right? So, and it links very much to what you said about a generational transition, right? So we are moving away from taking a bottom-up view, right? Classic CMDB is let's get all of the components, right, that exist within the services that you provide at an individual level. That's a server, that's a switch, that's a router, it's a firewall, etc., right? And take and build a service view, right, from all of those components. But actually, if we move to this experiential take on the world, then you start from the top and you work down, presumably, right? You look at what is the consumption of the service, right? What is the experience the consumer gets through that transaction, and you work down rather than up. Is that right?
Kind of, yeah. When the difference between the service economy and the experience economy is choice. When we design service, when we do service design, we're trying to think ahead. We're trying to stop the problems from happening. We're trying to make it so that it's an easy transition, so that when we roll out this new service or change an existing service, that people adopt and adapt, and it's a fruitful venture. But what's difficult is that when you switch to experience, the value is in the eye of the beholder. And if you aren't particularly close to those beholders and already having conversations with them and already seeing the world through their eyes, it can be a massive mindset shift. It can be a massive challenge to overcome. And to overcome those challenges, you kind of need enlightened executives, and you need teams that are experienced in kind of working this way. And to be honest, we need a mix-up. We need people who are willing to open their minds, try new things, and fail out loud, because that is part of understanding what your customers and colleagues need. I'll give you an example. I was on a call earlier today, and they said specifically that the chatbot that they re-rolled out this last year didn't go well. They just turned on a feature in a tool and turned on the chatbot, and it wasn't received well, and they ended up turning it off, and it kind of looked embarrassing, and they weren't planning ahead. And the lesson learned by that team was, don't just switch it on. If you find this feature that you're already paying for, you find this value that you could extract, don't just turn it on. And what great organizations are starting to do is they're starting to realize that what that person learned that I talked to earlier today, to not just turn it on, needs to be shared with the whole company so that everyone knows this, so that everyone gets the same perspective that IT does around technology change, and that we can pass that knowledge down to our colleagues and to the people in the business to make similar decisions, to learn what we have learned, to know what we know, and to help us make good choices too.
That sort of comes back to the planning, doesn't it? And looking ahead as to what impact is this going to have, right? I mean, that's a podcast episode in of itself. But Matt, you, in your role working as, for the software vendor that you do, and kind of one of the things we see, and we often have conversations around with clients, customers, prospects, and the like, is that they'll have a platform, and exactly to the point you've just made, right? There's latent features, that they've not enabled for whatever reason. When you're kind of in the process of talking to the people that you talk to about the solutions that your company provides, how do you kind of balance the distinction between here are some new features, here's some new functionality and capability that we've introduced, against the fact that they might not be using, let's say, a percentage of the existing features and functionality? How are you kind of balancing that conversation out in your mind, and indeed kind of relaying that to the people you're interacting with?
This is such a good one because it visits, I think this is a great question because it visits the foundation of what we think in technology around software. And that word is such an interesting word, software. And you said it in the question, actually. You said platform instead of software. And I believe that these are not the same thing. That software solves a problem, and a platform gives you your tools so that you can solve your own problem. And that differentiator is something that kind of melds in our minds. Like, for some reason, we've forgotten that there's software and then there's platforms, and they are not synonymous. They are very different animals. One usually requires a team of professionals that are trained and can solve a lot of business problems, and they're technically advanced, and they're really going to be interested in operating this thing for the next 30 years or however long your organization depends on it. And then there's software. And software, the goal in software is completely different. Over in platform space, you give people tools, they choke themselves to death on them, that's fine. Or they are super efficient and they get lots of value, that's fine. Over in the software world, the goal isn't necessarily to add more features all the time. Over in the software world, your goal is to solve those problems as elegantly and as simply as possible, and for as broad a range of people as possible as well, because you're trying to be the platform that someone has already built for the people that already have these challenges. And so when I think about software and features and technical debt, I tend to think of those two things in two different categories completely. If it's a platform and it's technical debt, that's a big deal for your customers. Your clients, you're not giving them the right tools to control their environment. You probably need to add more capabilities to help them manage the chaos that ensues as part of that platform management, platform as a service. And in the software side, if you're adding a feature, you should have the discipline to understand what are you removing to create that value. How are you going to make sure that you don't code this feature into a corner? How do you roll out features that are high value and low effort? And that is, to me, that's the philosophical problem of software. How do you actually do that? And to us, it means having a customer success team that helps our customers know what features are out there, what features they're not taking advantage of that they probably should be taking advantage of. And then we do a ton of outreach and research. In fact, that's my summer job, is I'm not flying around the world and presenting. And so during the summer, I listen to a lot of our customers and I listen to their challenges, and we as a team research them to understand, what are their current challenges, how are they talking about them, how are they thinking about them, and is there an opportunity for us to solve this problem with them?
Sorry, Sunil, just very quickly, that kind of talks to the top-down approach that you mentioned, Sunil, looking at the problem through the customer lens, I guess.
So our Invigate or ServiceNow or Freshservice, are they software or are they platforms?
That's a great question. That's a great follow-up question. Who is who? And to us, the way that we think about it is by code. Right. If you can code, then you're probably a platform. And if you can't write any code, then you're probably software. There are gray lines in between, but mostly that's where I put them.
Yeah. Okay. So we often describe this as toolbox versus non-toolbox, right? That's how we would typically, talk about it to our customers. but I get what you're saying there. So are you codable at Invigate, or are you non-codable?
We are non-code. We took a philosophical choice in
Software.
this to say no code, literally no code. You cannot code. Okay. Now, if you wanted to, because we have an API, you could build a front end and API with our system and literally do whatever you want. But not many of our customers are doing that.
Not by design, right?
Yeah, exactly. Because when you give IT people code, they code and they continue to code and they continue. You guys have seen it. They choke themselves eventually.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's just take these no code versus code, right? If you were an organization, one of those organizations that we started the conversation off in a position where some of your sort of fundamentals are fairly immature, let's say, what advice would you give, Matt, to those organizations to maybe make the choice between software versus platform, and also how to think about getting ready to be able to leverage the features or benefits that choice brings you? Because I think this is, we see a fairly malleable ITSM, ESM marketplace. And what I mean by that is that, people are changing tools still fairly frequently, right? I mean, it's maybe not every 3 years, but it's probably every 5 or 6. Some organizations stay for much longer, others change more rapidly. But that's fairly short-term investments, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
So there's dissatisfaction. There's people who feel like they're not getting the benefits. So the question, what's your advice? How do they think about this problem? How should they tackle it?
This is the age-old question. This is such a hard one. When people ask me this question, because I've consulted for some of the largest organizations in the world. I did ServiceNow implementations for just over 10 years, and when these conversations happen, the first thing that I go to is total cost of ownership. And I say that as if it's like a really easy number you can just put out there, like, here's the price tag. But in reality, we all know that finding the total cost of a tool is very, very difficult. Like your car, for example, is a very difficult tool to understand the total cost for. Do you incorporate your garage into that? I every once in a while I have to bring Windex out and wash the windows on my car manually because my dog licks the window. Okay, well, that's another total cost of ownership, and those details matter. The total cost of owning something is so important to understand the return on investment. That is why executives don't stick their neck out. If they don't understand what the actual return is on an investment, why would I stick my neck out? Why spend $5 million to fix a $1 million problem? Why spend $5 million to fix a $1 million annual problem that you're only going to have for the next 4 years? So it's one of those things where you cannot predict the future. Only you truly understand your context. And an outside person is going to give you some additional context that's going to help when it comes to the market. And so oftentimes I'll provide input to people and provide advice, but the main things come down to this. How do you want to structure your teams? What is the culture for exploring in your organization? And how are you going to control your switching costs going forward? And I think those 3 questions, when you ask those 3 questions, you start to understand what they're willing to put up with when it comes to either switching to software or switching to platform or keeping their current model if they're doing one of these. So a lot of the larger organizations that I worked with, they wanted to have a platform. They needed the power of a platform. They needed a platform that did magic, that did things that they hadn't even dreamed up yet. And that, I'm talking about huge telcos, large financial organizations, anything that's over $1 trillion. They probably need something that's going to be really powerful, touch on their ERP system, integrate with every one of their other systems. It has to be super flexible, and they're going to have an army of developers on this. It's going to be 30 to 50 people, and they're all going to be trained. They're going to have their own team. They're going to be their own silo. And it'll work great. And then there are the other teams where it's like kind of in the middle. You're large middle-sized, or you're middle-sized, or even if you're small-sized but you want to be innovative, and maybe you actually want to keep an ITSM team around. And for those people, I usually ask specifically, how are you controlling your costs? Because those little guys, the smaller your organization, the less negotiation power you have, especially against some of these larger vendors, and the less pull you have on a lot of their features, and asking them for what you need, because you're not a $10 million account or even $1 million annual account. So it really comes down to, for those organizations, culture, product, fit. And not many people use that term. Most people think product market fit, but that's for a market. When you're selecting a specific tool, it's like, hey, does the vibe of the software vendor that you're buying from match the vibe of your team? Does your team want to chat with the software vendor or call them? Does the software vendor want to be chatted to or called? And matching those two things up is so important. And so for those organizations, usually I'm telling them, hey, try them out, put them in place. Most of these tools have a 30-day trial, or even longer in some cases, and have your teams use them. Have them put them in as a proof of concept. I know AI is going to make this stuff a lot easier going forward, but for now, you got to do the hard work and just kind of make the teams select and hope that the teams can select. I do want to go one more point here, and that is around the ITIL question, because I think that's kind of what you were getting at. Should a small organization train ITIL and just buy a tool that promises they're going to be able to do ITIL in a couple weeks? And I think we all know, or hopefully we've all learned at this point, that does not exist. Best practices exist for a reason, but they do need to be molded to fit your organization and your personal needs, I shouldn't say personal needs, your teams and your company's needs. And ITIL is a lagging best practice. As all best practice is, it's a lagging indicator of what you need to do as an organization in IT, because it takes time for best practice to be researched, discovered, explored, published, vetted, and then trained on. And so those will always be lagging indicators. And so for ITIL, yes, it's super useful to understand ITIL, especially when stuff is going bad, or you're trying to re-architect solutions or something like that, or you're looking for something to just make your organization more stable, your infrastructure more stable. But it's not the end-all be-all. You cannot study ITIL and think that you know everything about IT. It just does not work that way anymore. You need to be diverse in your understanding. You need to read things like Verism. You need to study. You should definitely be familiar with the ISO standards. You should definitely be familiar with COBIT and lean thinking. And that is the advice that I give to everyone in the world, actually, when it comes to IT. Just diversify. Always be diversifying your ideas, because technology is so young. It's maybe a 50-year-old industry. We have so much further to go. Over the next 50 years, think about how much innovation is going to happen. I mean, that'll be double our lifespan as an industry. And so I think thinking diversely, having that open mind, is really going to serve most people in our industry very, very well.
Dan, I know you have a question, but I'm just going to really quickly jump in. Apologies. So I think there's one other thing that I would add to that, right, which I think you've touched on, Matt, but ambition is really key as well to decision making, I think. And it sort of comes back in a way to the cultural fit element. I mean, Dan and I did a podcast last year, actually, with a managed service provider that went to market did a very thorough assessment of many tools out there. There was an extremely complicated spreadsheet that was involved, but ultimately they picked on the basis of cultural fit with the vendor. Did they feel like that vendor would go on the journey with them or not? Did they, and so ultimately that was their decision. But ambition, right, and the ambition of the vendor as well to support your ambition, if that makes sense. Yeah, absolutely critical, I would say.
Big time.
Definitely, I think having that conversation, like, could I work with these guys? I think is one to have, right? Yeah. So my question, Sunil, you just interrupted me on there. Then, Matt, you're based in the US, and I think a lot of people's perception is that in America, in the United States, great service. That's a sort of a synonymous. Not trying to typecast or generalize too much, but typically it's like really great service you get in America, and I guess that would potentially stripe across kind of the IT service management and enterprise service management space. With that in mind, and kind of the generalization again that the US is ahead in terms of that service delivery kind of arch there, how do you see kind of the current state of play presently? And then what sort of things, perhaps with our listeners over here in the UK and into Europe, maybe should be looking out for or thinking about that's going to land in, let's say, the next 6 to 12 months? What's your view on those kind of elements that we could potentially see?
Yeah, the big one, of course, is AI. If you haven't read it on the internet,
we've heard of that over here. Yeah,
you've heard about it. You've heard.
Yeah.
But what I'm seeing in the States is that people are starting to actually dip their toes in. I saw a case study from Wendy's recently where they were showcasing an AI feature that they used, and their IT team presented it at, I want to say, Service Management World. I think that's right. So we are starting to see that actually happening, like actual use cases of people putting in AI, using large language models to have those customer interactions and solve big problems and save costs, be more efficient and have more capability and capacity. The second thing that I'm seeing that people have been investing over the last year or two has been in experience management. I would say that it used to be no one was that interested in experience management or even really understood it. And now when you go to conferences, you hear IT people talking about their personas, the journeys that they're putting their customers on. They're starting to really reap the benefits of experience management. And I think part of that is just because it's further along in its maturity. Experience has been here for a while, and human-centered design it's been a mature practice for a long time. And so we're just kind of adding it to service management. So I think that's one of the things that really gives me a lot of hope. And I've seen some real XLAs now. So I'm really hopeful and optimistic that experience management is going to keep service management relevant. And then the other things that I'm seeing in our space are focused on AI, just because it's so new and so edge. And the two patterns that I'm starting to see is a growth in training. So many organizations have both an internal training that they're doing, as well as several external training classes that employees can pick from, and that's giving them some of that compliance for the internal training, and really some of the professional development. We're investing in you as employees, and you're going to be learning this incredible technology, so let's give you these external benefits. So we're starting to see that happening at organizations. And then the last thing that we're starting to see is that IT teams are finally starting to give their companies playgrounds to mess around with AI and start learning how to use these tools. I think that people have been doing the swivel seat stuff a lot. I'm looking at my computer here, and then I type into an LLM here, and then I type it into the computer. It's swivel seat, we used to do that all the time within systems. And so people are doing that for AI right now. And I think IT and corporate security and really the organization at large has started to realize, hey, people won't take no for an answer. When we say no to AI, they're just going somewhere else. They're doing shadow AI work. Instead, let's give them Copilot Enterprise Edition. Let's give them Gemini. Let's give them whatever, local host, open AI LLM, whatever you need to do. Give them that playground, because when you tell them no, that's a huge security risk.
I think that's really, really interesting, and actually in many ways underlines the point behind the question, which is that the US does tend to lead, right? In, partly due to a, less regulatory environment, but also a culture of, innovation and money helps, but also not necessarily a happiness, but a willingness to fail. That's a big part of it. We culturally aren't so cool with that sort of thing, and I think it's a big opportunity, I would say, for certainly the UK, right, to be prepared to fail more. But because I don't think we're seeing yet, Dan, are we, company-wide investment in AI technologies? There's lots of talk, but not yet necessarily strategy.
Yeah. Not hugely, certainly.
Yeah.
And I'll just add
Training
to that, I think,
as well. We don't see that very much, do we?
Yeah.
Sorry.
It's potentially lighter touch adoption, and I think to that whole kind of cultural thing, there's probably a little bit more risk aversion, let's call it, in the UK. But yeah, as you said, Sunil, it's just not cool to fail, right, in the UK.
Well, and certainly in Europe, right, and where they have much more sort of socially minded culture and economies, right, that actually failure has a societal impact, and so they want to try and avoid that societal impact as much as possible, right? Whereas perhaps in America, it's a little bit more kind of like, it's okay, because you can bounce. Yeah, maybe it's not so easy to bounce in other areas or other countries, but very, very interesting. So we should expect to see strategy and actual decision making around investment in AI. We should expect to see training alongside that. And as you said, Matt, we should expect to see playgrounds, right? So an opportunity for teams to go and practice, try, break things in a reasonably safe environment, right, in order to drive innovation through their organization. I think that would be great.
Yeah, precisely.
And I think it will happen, right?
That was a great observation about our cultures, though. I didn't connect that. That totally makes sense. Why social governing countries would think about that differently, whereas in America, it's very cowboy, very Wild West, me and mine kind of thing. That totally makes sense. And also, I think another thing I'll just throw in here, that companies that learn how to experiment better are the ones that are going to be successful going forward. The ones that understand, hey, we're going to do this thing, and we're going to do it just this way in a safe way, and then we're going to share what we learned and just keep doing that over and over and over. Those organizations are the ones that are starting to really take advantage of that failure. The understanding that best practice is being written while they're doing it.
Yeah, that's so right, because certainly in the UK, right, we have a culture of focusing on the outcome, right, and not on what you've learned, right. Whereas if you have a culture of focusing on the learning experience, right, not so much the outcome, but the learning experience, it sets you up better for the future. But anyway, we will take your innovation secondhand and use it as best we can.
Love it.
Matt, just before we wrap up this session, it would be really remiss of us if we didn't just give a shout out to yourself being a fellow podcaster. Tell us a little bit about kind of your experiences, because Sunil and I have been doing this for just over a year now. Why did you decide to start podcasting? What's your experience been like? And, where are you hoping to go with that?
Great.
And feel free to plug it as much as you'd like, right, for our listeners.
I appreciate that. Yeah, ticket volume is fantastic. It's one of my favorite podcasts. I've launched 4, and I started about 15 years ago, and it started with a tweet. It started with Chris Dancy tweeting out, "I'm starting an ITSM podcast. Who wants in?" And back then, the ITIL world, a lot of people were on Twitter because it had been there just long enough for the nerds to get on there, and a lot of people responded. And I was just a young service desk manager who was totally naive and had a ton of dumb questions. And it was great to be on that podcast because I was the one who was asking all the dumb questions. And that was perfect because a podcast needs someone who's going to ask questions. And it really made ITSM Weekly one of the most rewarding projects I've ever been a part of. It connected me with so many people in the ITIL and ITSM industries that I would be remiss if I didn't shout out Chris Dancy and Matt Hooper for starting that project and being a part of that with me. That was amazing. And we launched 2 more after that. One was Snapcast, which was a ServiceNow podcast. It was basically technical in mind and concept, and we would just hack on ServiceNow. So like we did a social media integration with Twitter and Facebook this was back in like 2015, so 10 years ago, when that stuff really wasn't that interesting, or it wasn't that commonplace, I guess. We weren't thinking social media with service management back then. And then we launched Hacking Business Technology after that, and that was Mark Kawasaki, Farah Remtula, and myself. It was a fantastic podcast, really just around IT and like how to think differently when you're applying technology to a business. And then Ticket Volume, and I love Ticket Volume because it's the first podcast I've ever hosted where I'm the only person, I'm the only host. So I get to decide a lot more, which is really nice. There's way less discussion about what we're going to do because I'm just going to do it. And then finding Invigate. Invigate really wanted to grow in the US market and kind of get their name out there. And so they were willing to take Ticket Volume and really grow it into its own little side company. Like we've got an editor, we've got staff that works on the editorial calendar, we've got staff that works on the content that gets published around Ticket Volume, and then I've got a set of designers that I can leverage for rebranding if we want to change the colors and the real branding. All these people are way better at their jobs than I am at any of those things. I'm only good at just being here and talking about IT stuff. So it's super useful to have that team, and I have to give them a huge shout out because they're the reason Ticket Volume works. I also have to give them a shout out because I couldn't think of a great punny name for the podcast, and so when they came up with Ticket Volume, I was like, oh, why didn't I think of that? Volume ticket. It's just brilliant.
Very good.
Fantastic.
Well, we'll look forward to the team, Dan, joining soon.
Well, this is what we need, Kyle. I'm making some notes here. We need to get
production quality
team, right? Matt,
Do it.
thank you so much for taking time to speak with us today. Really brilliant conversation. To all our listeners out there, do check out Ticket Volume, Matt Beran podcast. If you've got anything specific, reach out to Matt. I'm sure he'd be more than happy to get in touch and have a chat with you about any topics that we've talked about today and possibly others. Sunil, any other closing words? Or
no, just to say thank you very much, Matt. It's
Yeah.
been super. We've really enjoyed it. So really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Likewise. Thanks for
Thanks
having
for
me,
listening,
gentlemen.
folks. See you on the next Everything Service Management podcast.